So first of all, just to say thank you very much for taking time on this Thursday morning in half term to come and listen to this session. We've got three of my colleagues from Durham here today. There's myself, I'm the head of research policy, and Catherine Brewer, who is the research policy officer in my team, and we look after research governance, policy, ethics and compliance. And I'm very pleased to have Kristina Holt and David Cull coming from our information governance service. So the majority of the work that we're doing today, this is the first of three sessions. So this is a broad overview, giving you an overview of ethics, integrity, governance, responsible research innovation. And then, as I say, my colleagues from information governance are going to give you a more comprehensive overview of data privacy and things coming into their area. This is the first time that we have put this session together in this way, so hopefully it will keep to time. If it ends up going a bit over, we can concertina down and perhaps do something a bit different with the case study than we've got planned. And yes, hopefully this is a good foundation for the upcoming sessions on NHS and health data and AI and machine learning. So on that, I'm going to pass over to Catherine, who's going to start you off on ethics.
Right, so starting briefly with a brief definition of ethics, integrity and governance, because these are areas that intersect in research. So ethics is largely outward looking. I would say it's about relationships and impacts on the subjects and the beneficiaries of the research. And it's often about balancing. It's recognizing that what is the right thing to do is not always clear cut. The integrity is about the conduct of the research. That's more value driven. It's about openness and respect, rigor in your research process. And governance is more about compliance. So it's working within the rules and requirements and the processes that you need to follow to do your research in the right way. So together, they're all about good research practice. And ethics, so the common view of research ethics is that it's about assessment of risks. As the way that we consider research ethics is largely drawn from medical research. So it's thinking about participants taking part in clinical studies. There are clear risks if they are undergoing procedures or taking new supplements, for example. But a lot of research risk is not so obvious or clear cut in that way. And also the way we think about ethics is based on research involving human participants. And so we think about research on individuals or also possibly research on animals. And while these are important, the ethical framework we think about now is broadened. So we also think about things like impact on the environment. And a lot of what you're likely to be doing in data studies could be working with emerging technologies, and those may raise different kinds of ethical questions. So it's important to think about ethics quite broadly in the project. And even if you think it's not one that poses risks for people or animals, environment in that kind of way, it may still benefit from ethical reflection and review. So there's four principles of ethics, commonly referred to: autonomy, beneficence, non-malfeasance, and justice. So autonomy for research with participants is about how they are involved or engaged, the consent process. And if it's not about consenting to or recognition of particular risks, it's about engaging them in a way that is respectful, making sure that they understand the research and what is involved in participating, and that they are potentially involved in shaping that research depending on the kind of research that you're doing. If you're working with secondary data, then there are questions about how people might have expected their data to be used when they provided it. So that you're looking at the basis on which that data was provided, consent, if there is consent attached to it. And also, if you're looking at data that is online, for example, thinking about the kind of expectations that people may have had around that data when they put it online. Are they aware that they are putting it into a public space, for example, if you're looking at social media? So there are governance questions around that as well, and that will come up when our information governance colleagues talk in more detail about that. But from the ethical question, it's not just about what can you do with it, what are you allowed to do with the data, it's about what's right to do with the data, what should you do with it. Beneficence is about research, I think research generally, it should be in the public good, which is quite a vague term, really. So it's thinking about what that means in practice. So kind of documenting and evidencing the benefits of your research, which involves giving a realistic assessment of the likelihood of realizing those benefits. So we may think that our research may have the potential to make significant changes, but what's the likelihood of that actually happening, and what things in your research process or the way you're doing it might limit the benefits, might limit the impact of the research, and trying to minimize those limitations. And then non-malfeasance is about avoiding harm. So for data research, that can involve harms. The UK Statistics Authority has quite a useful checklist on potential harms and benefits of data research. They're looking at particularly geospatial data, but a lot of the things that they talk about are more widely relevant for data. And it's looking at things like, does your research or what you're producing, does it have the potential to be used to make decisions about individuals or groups? Are there potential biases in the data sources or in the methods that you're using, and ways that could discriminate or disadvantage or exclude people in the way that that data is put into practice in your research outputs? And those are particularly questions for kind of AI research. I think that's going to be covered in more detail on the AI session, the third session in this series. There are also questions of potential for misrepresentation in data. So if you are using images, if you're translating the data that you're finding into images to make sense of big data sets, the choice of the images, even things like the choice of colors, can be significant in the way that is then interpreted and received by the people looking at that data. And there are also questions about breach of confidentiality and the ways that you could analyze data to make possible the identification of individuals, even if you're working with data that is apparently anonymized. And that is, again, something that our information governance colleagues will talk about in more detail. And then justice. So I think traditionally that is about the distribution of the benefits of research. So those who contributed their data should be seeing a benefit from the way that it's being used. But it also could be thinking about equity in the process. So the way that if you are collecting data, primary data, are you collecting it in a way that is accessible, that potentially disadvantaged groups could access, or does the way that you are collecting the data potentially exclude particular groups or people? And if you're looking at online or secondary data, it's thinking about who is likely to be contributing data in the source that you are looking at, and is that likely to be biased towards any particular group or to exclude groups? So why is it important? Well, I hope it's fairly clear that looking at research ethics it will promote values that are essential to basically to good research. But it's also about public trust. So particularly if you're working in new areas or developing areas where there could be anxiety, and AI again is a good example of that. Having clear processes, making sure that you are evaluating the impacts of the research and being transparent and communicating about that research can be important to establish that kind of trust. And it's also about improving the research design. Going through the ethical review process, hopefully, is not just jumping through hoops, it's getting feedback that will help you improve the design of your research. So the areas for ethical consideration, and these are areas that we look at Durham, and so it may vary for different universities, may have slightly different areas or combine them in different ways. But common areas, NHS and social care. So if you are looking at NHS, and particularly if you're involving NHS patients or patient data, then you may well need NHS ethical approval, and that is a separate process. And there are other processes for access to NHS data, and that's something that will be covered in more detail in the next session on health data. Other areas are likely to go through a review in your institution, and again, those processes will vary by institution. If you are using animal data, your university may have an animal welfare ethical review board, and they may be interested in the use of data that is collected from research on animals, particularly if there are any concerns the way in which that data was collected did not meet equivalent UK animal welfare standards. So if there are concerns about the source of the data, it's likely that you may need to put that through ethical review to check the balance of, I guess, the positive of making use of data that is available versus concerns about how that data may have been collected. Sensitive materials, the data, that could be things about working with data from things like WikiLeaks. So data that has sensitivities around the way it's collected or the way it was produced, and the questions about then how you might make use of that data in research. For international, there are questions about the different cultural and ethical frameworks, which again may be relevant in working with data. If you're looking at data from different countries, it's understanding the cultural context in which that data was produced, and indeed your own potential cultural biases. And indeed that could be relevant not only for international research, but for looking at different cultural groups within the UK. Collaboration and source of funds, that is again about the source. Are there questions about how funding or other resources in the project were obtained, or about the conduct of people, other groups involved in the project? Outputs merges with responsible research and innovation questions that Niall's going to talk about later. And this is looking at the potential ways in which research outputs could be used, whether there are unintended harms that could arise or the potential for misuse. And again, in data, I think looking at data profiling and Cambridge Analytica, which is something that Niall's going to talk about later, is an example of that. When people did that research, did they know how it could be used and what could arise from it? We've mentioned the UK Statistics Authority there, which I've already mentioned, which looks at ethical considerations in the use of geospatial data. And as I said, that again has considerations that could be relevant for other data studies, and we'll provide a link to that in the resources.
I'm just going to briefly touch on research integrity, and I think the key reason that I put this slide in here, and I'm sure you all know this, so I won't overdo it, but poor quality science is clearly unethical, and research integrity is all about conducting your research in such a way that other people have confidence that you've done it in the right way, the methods are sound, the findings are sound, that you've met all the standards of professionalism and rigor and so on that you need to. It is an area of long-standing concern, though, and I think we've had studies going back to about 2012 to say something of between 10 and 25% of researchers have first-hand experience of poor conduct. It's quite easy to understand poor conduct in research integrity because it's really things like fraud, intentional misleading of people. But it's a spectrum. Fraud is very significant, but it's very rare. Other things are non-reported studies, so especially for things like pharmaceuticals. A 2014 study found that only about 54% of trials are published. That's because sometimes publishers like positive results rather than negative results. If you're funded to do something that doesn't work, there's not a lot in it. But a particular, I think, risk for data science is around misreporting. So if you have a big enough data set, there is the temptation to select data that supports your hypothesis. And again, there's very clear solutions to that in terms of identifying in advance what data you're going to use to support your hypothesis. But it's an issue that, from the government's perspective especially, I mean, we had a Science and Technology Committee inquiry into this in 2017. We've just had another call for evidence for reproducibility, because actually the government is worried about this. It's worried about the consequences of poor research integrity. It's obviously wasted time, money, and effort. That obviously has an impact on public support for research, but then take it to its logical conclusion. If we're talking about medical sciences and we're basing our clinical decisions on something that is not accurate, then there are real impacts on people's health, lives, and well-being. I think integrity is really about doing things in the right way. It's not, I mean, Wellcome Trust have done a lot of work on this, looking at actually academic institutions and funders put a lot of, understandably, a a lot of faith in outcomes based. This is what you produce from the research. These are the papers you had. These are the patents. This is the impact it had. But actually, that's one way of measuring things. But also the other way of measuring it is how you're doing it. So are you doing it in a way? And things like reproducibility, it's a lot of effort to curate a data set, to make it usable to other people, to put down your methodology in a very open, clear, transparent way. That's effort that isn't really rewarded in the traditional model, because that takes time away from moving on to the next grant and the next project and the next outcome. So there is, I feel there is a zeitgeist in our university and across the sector, really, to start looking at actually valuing the way in which things are done, rather than necessarily just looking at the broad outputs, recognizing things like mentoring and so on.
Yes, so also on that, I think the funders and professional bodies produce guidance on good research practice that is tailored to particular disciplines. So that is potentially good resources on research integrity. And for emerging areas, it's important to keep up to date with the emerging guidelines and re-evaluating the processes during the life of the project. So this is not a one-time thing. Research integrity is an ongoing process throughout the life of the project. And open science and open data. So as Niall's mentioned, that concern about reproducibility has been something that's been highlighted, and open data, open science isn't to extend a response to that. And a lot of this is about balancing the requirements for security and confidentiality and openness. So it's not about making all data open regardless. It's about thinking, how can I make my data open in a way that respects any restrictions around confidentiality if it's personal data, or if you have commercially sensitive data, how you can make that open without compromising that. And working with personal data, anonymization is key to this. But as previously mentioned, and as Kristina will talk about later, I think there are ways of anonymizing data that are more anonymous than others, different ways of doing this. And it's to be being careful about whether the data you put out is actually truly anonymous. And another question is about security, I think, versus usability. So if you have data that is sensitive, then you'll need to put in place security controls around it. But you also need to be able to use that data for your research. There's no good looking it down so completely that you can't do anything with it. So it's looking at what you need to do and what's practical for your research. And also from an ethical point of view, that it's important, if you've got data that people have provided, to make good use of that data. It's not ethical to collect it and then not use it, or not use it to the extent or the ways in which people are expecting it to be used. And the UK Reproducibility Network has some good resources on open research, including some practical guides on data sharing and also sharing open code and software, which is another thing that may be helpful for data research.
Two quick slides on governance before we moved on to ethical challenges in computational research. So very quickly, the question of what is governance? And I mean, I've put this in here because it's important, because governance is all about the regulations and principles that are there to make sure your research is run in a particular way. And it's complicated. It can be, so I'll caveat that and say it can be complicated. Because if you're working with particular funders or particular data providers, they have particular stipulations clearly for things like patient data. There have to be really robust safeguards in place to ensure that's used appropriately and used responsibly and securely as well. So there are all sorts of different things, and it does depend. So obviously, if you're a UK institution, we're regulated by the OFS, by UKRI. They give us standards in terms of what they expect. Each university has their own particular standards. We have obligations under law and so on and so forth. So it can be very, very complicated. What I would say here, and the question of who sets standards, the answer is it depends what you're doing, who you're doing it with, and what area. Unless it's a highly regulated area, so unless it's particularly around patient or special category data, generally speaking, your university policy will be sufficient. But I suppose the other message is always is ask. The university policy there is there as a minimum standard. That is the minimum that, from Durham's perspective and from other institutions' perspective, what we expect you to do in terms of all these different areas. If there is another policy that is more robust, that provides greater protection to participants, then fine. I mean, we operate that principle of subsidiarity, which is if there's something more robust elsewhere, that's fine, we accept that. If there is an occasion, and there do occasionally come times when people say, actually, my funder says it must be this, particularly when you're doing research in international context, say, well, these are the local regulations, it must be done this way. That isn't necessarily for you to solve as an academic in that area. That is for professional services to solve. Ask the question. When we get asked these questions, we work with those individuals, and where there are times where we can't quite square the circle, we normally come up with a compromise there. I haven't ever seen an area where we've turned around and said absolutely not. Sometimes we do, when it's a legal requirement, we have to dig our heels in, but most times we're very pragmatic about this sorts of things. So ask and it will be fine is the key message there. Just coming on to the governance considerations on the next slide. These are the types of things that we ask people to look at. So these are the types of governance considerations we ask people to look at. So they're distinct from ethics, but they are relevant. So I mean, thinking about the things that are likely to affect computational research are things like the data type, the IP. Are there publication restrictions associated with what you're doing? What's the storage like? Where are you going to put this data? Who's going to have access to it? What do they have to do to demonstrate that they are competent to handle it? And perhaps most telling, I mean, this I think will probably be picked up by Kristina and David. If you're collaborating, that brings a whole host of issues, because then other people are bound by different contracts. There might be different legal jurisdictions. That really brings complications. And again, they're often soluble, but sometimes if you know it's going to involve, say, working with the United States and then working with sub-Saharan Africa and then working with another area, these projects happen, come early, because it takes a while to resolve them, but they are resolvable. So I put a couple of examples on here. I'm going to go through them, but actually I think what I'd like to do, because I think we're probably bang on time, it's once I've got to the end, I'm very happy to open it up and see if anyone else wants to bring in, so any that they are aware of. So coming first to autonomy, which is, as Catherine said, is sort of respect for individuals. So we're going to have a case study on Cambridge Analytica later. But actually, autonomy and consent comes down to expectation. So Twitter's a really good example of this. So after the Cambridge Analytica scandal, lots of platforms really shut down academic access to area. Twitter haven't done that. So it's still relatively open use for its academic research. The question I always have is how many people read the terms and conditions that said what that's going to be used for. I barely skim read the ones from my bank, and that's all about money. So I think the realistic answer is not very many. So if that's the case, does it really meet? It doesn't meet the standards for our historical standards for consent. If we then start looking at things like the tools like Scrape Hero, which is just for looking at historical Twitter data, and ScrapeScorn, which is another tool that just scrapes the whole visual scrape of the whole of the internet. You guys probably know more about this than I do. That absolutely doesn't meet our historical standards for consent. There are questions about what you'd reasonably expect to put online and the reasonable expectations of use, but universities are held to quite high standards for this. So you need to be really clear when you're looking at this, what it's used for. And again, coming back to Catherine's questions around harms, what could happen if someone's data from 10, 15 years ago was then compiled in such a way that showed them in a bad light, for example. So coming on to equity and equality, I mean, I'll give you a product example first, because I think there is another one that is more computer science based, but I was reading, it was in The Economist, on how health care is not racially blind, and they were giving the example of the pulse oximeter, which is a thing you put on people's finger. It tells you what your blood oxygenation levels are. 92 to 96%, you're in pretty good hands. Anything less than that, it's not good. So obviously in COVID, they were using these as a very quick triage and diagnostic tool. The only thing is, these devices were invented by and tested by predominantly white male engineers. So actually, for Black patients, they overestimate saturation, so the amount of oxygen in blood, by 5%, 3 times more often than they do for white patients. So that clearly has real clinical outcomes for people. And that is a question then of equality and quality, the data that you're putting in that feeds the algorithm that pushes the outcomes out. Another one from the US, there are other ones, but there is the Compass algorithm. This was in the news a couple of years ago as well. So this was a tool to guide sentencing. So by saying predicting the likelihood of reoffending, of recidivism. And basically, there was a couple of studies that came out that said it overestimated the likelihood of reoffending for Black people and underestimated for white people. And the company disputes that. What is interesting, though, is the New Scientist had a piece in it in 2018 that showed it was no better than random people on the internet guessing. So there is a question there about value. These things have real impact. I mean, there are other examples of this as well. So we all think that the search engines are relatively neutral and fair, but you look at things like translations and it ends up throwing up very gendered languages. There was the criticism of Google, again, for targeting ads for more senior positions and science and technology jobs more to men, because the algorithm says more men click on these ads, then it will show more of these ads to men. It's a significant concern. So the next one I'll talk about very quickly is the informational asymmetry. And again, this comes to output. So this is clearly information asymmetry is when one party has a huge amount of information and the other party has very little information. There is an advantage, clearly. If you have information is power. If you have that information, you can use it and you have power and advantage of the individuals who perhaps provided you that data. I'm going to skip over privacy very well. I'll quickly say it is a concern for people. Despite our actions of not being very careful with our data, the surveys normally say about between 60 75% of UK people are very worried about privacy, very worried about what's online, what it says about where you live, what your income is, what your job is, who your family are. People aren't very happy about that, and that's something that we need to consider from an ethical perspective here. The black box outcomes, I think the key thing here is my understanding of machine learning. Again, I realize I'm probably talking to a room full of people who understand this much better than I do, but they're probabilistic. And actually, there are big risks in this. If you have enormous data sets, it relies on seeing patterns between the data, identifying correlation, and so on. But if you have a huge amount of data, I think it's called apophenia. So there are patterns within the data. You see patterns within the data, machines see patterns within the data where it doesn't exist. And then you get onto things like deep learning, where the computer is constantly, the algorithm is constantly learning from the information. What that means is this, you may end up in a situation where you can't fully explain why you have the outcomes you have based on the inputs that went in and the algorithm that's in there. That's very dangerous. I think I've got a couple more examples that I'm just going to briefly come on to. There are issues as well about data quality. How about the timeliness? This is all about the timeliness, the completeness, the accuracy of the data set. I'm going to give you another clinical example here. You can very easily look at people's quantitative data to say, well, this person's heart rate was this, their BMI was this, their stage of illness was this, and these were their outcomes. But that really ignores some of the less tangible things. So impact of family support, impact of faith, things like other social support, willingness to live can have a massive impact on outcomes there. And those aren't always factored for here. And I think that's one of the cautionary tales in terms of computational research and ethics. And the final one, because I love a sport example, is force certainty. So the best example I have, I think, here is around cricket, or tennis if you prefer tennis. And it's the use of the Hawkeye technology. So technology in sport has really been there to augment the umpire's decisions, or the referee's decisions, whoever you like. And if they're not sure, it gives you an idea of, it gives you a model that says, this ball was going to bowl the individual out, it was going to be LBW, or it was going to go out on the serve. Therefore, it's out. But actually, it's been identified that that isn't how it works. It's not a perfect model. That's fine. What it should really show is the range of where the ball is. It could have been more out or less out, or right on the line. It's very difficult to do that, and that's not how it's presented. And it really does give that false certainty. Nobody appeals against the Hawkeye decision, because it's that false certainty that that machine knows best and is giving you the absolute truth, and that's not the case. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. So, key risk areas for these studies. So, I mean, these are the sorts of things that, if you're doing this sort of work, are flags to look at what you're doing with them and who you're doing it with. And I mean, Catherine hasn't mentioned our ethics process because it will differ across universities, but broadly speaking, our ethics process is, if it's relatively low risk, it gets in our case, an automatic approval once you've answered some questions, but then goes into a more in-depth approval requiring review by human beings, looking at things and looking at the risks and the benefits and the harms and everything else. If you're doing this sort of any research involving this sort of work, so that might be, I mean, a good example would be anonymized data sets with potential for re-identification. There was something that we did at a few years ago, which was around gait analysis. Apparently our gaits are all as individual as our fingerprints and our retinas. So actually, you can re-identify people, in theory, looking at a big enough data set and from high enough quality CCTV image, you can see who those people are. So even in a public space, you could potentially say, well, I actually know who these individuals are in here. Any of these things, I think, would mainly would require that escalation upwards. The one that I would also touch on, which is close to my heart as a bugbear, is what's the power of the funder? What's the power of the provider? So if the funder is funding a particular contract project, they're setting the question for you. And although we will all behave with integrity, that sets the framework in which you're going to be operating. And that's something that really needs to be looked at. And likewise for the provider, if you're getting data, if you're accessing it through a gatekeeper, they have the power to give you a slice of the data that is not necessarily fully complete, or maybe is time stamped, again, to give you a particular 3 months rather than 6 months, and that bigger data set would show you a lot more information. It would give you perhaps different conclusions. Always be wary of what is being provided to you, and the breadth and length and comprehensiveness of that data set. We are worried about that because of the different legal regimes for the consent for collecting that data might be entirely different to what we normally expect. It's also a question around what sort of data we're sending across borders and across institutions. So clearly, again, any sort of personal data, or any data, it doesn't have to be personal. Let's say that you're doing work on an algorithm that looks at, I don't know, atmospheric opacity. And you say, well, that's great, we're doing it for astronomy reasons. The government will the UK government will turn around and say, well, actually, if you can use it to look up, you can use it to look down. That's a satellite issue. That's therefore subject to export control. So it's one of those things that there are big governance questions around working internationally. They're not, as I say, they're not impossible to resolve, but they are they can be complicated. So it's just a risk like when we have it, because you might be sending data, you might be sending conclusions outside a known legal framework. No, it shouldn't be. It's always worth asking the question, though. But no, it shouldn't be. You're absolutely right. I suppose it depends where you're gathering that linguistic data from. It should not be.
The point on this slide is not that all these things are always a problem, but if you're doing these things, then it's worth giving consideration to whether there are risks or not.
Hi everyone, I'm Kristina Holt. I'm Head of Information Governance. I'm also the Data Protection Officer at Durham University. So I have particular interest in personal data issues for that reason, and we focus a little bit on that. So we're going to go through these things very quickly because I'm only pressed for time and it's relatively high level. So forgive me if it is a little bit too basic for some of you who weren't entirely sure how to pitch it. So if we've got it wrong, you can give us that feedback and we can change it or even come back and give you a more detailed explanation on some bits you're interested in. So we're going to do, first of all, how we describe the risks, what we're assessing, Then some sort of bit of a deep dive, well, not that deep, a shallow dive in relation to data privacy, and then there's a little bit of a case study at the back, just flags a couple of issues that can come about with big data sets. So let's go, Catherine, can I get the next slide? Here we go. So what we've tried to do at Durham recently is to make matters a little bit simpler for people, and one of the ways we've done this is by getting ourselves 5 risks. What these do is broadly cover off the areas of regulation, funder requirements, and also just sort of our policy positions that we want to cover off in our policies. So basically, if you follow our policies, the idea will be you will be complying with our standard of what we're prepared to accept in terms of these risks. And if you do, you will be in a happy place. So in a sense, it means you at the front trying to do some research, or even if it's not research, something else on the professional services side, you should be compliant and you don't really need to worry too much. And the policy will tell you when you need to go away and ask for someone for help. But otherwise, you should be in a happy place just following the policies. And I'm just sort of explaining this so you understand what sits behind those policies. The first thing that sits behind them are these risks, and they are security, fairness, transparency, rights, and accountability. You will see that they talk to the same sorts of issues that we've just been talking about in terms of ethics. That's not surprising. You say the same things over and over again. And there are some examples there of what we mean by those. So on the security side, you know, that's a data breach, the obvious thing. Ransomware attack, which we're all a bit familiar with after, you know, things over this summer, especially in the higher education sector. But then we've got the things like fairness. So this is the things about, you know, profiling. That's quite important. Discrimination comes under that bit. Transparency. We've just spoken about that. You know, actually, how can we share our data? That is in tension with security. So that's an interesting thing to sort of need to balance out. The other thing is rights. So, you know, we do have data subjects have their own rights to ask for information. Other people have rights to ask for information about what we're doing, including our regulators. So we have to explain ourselves to them. So some of what we're trying to do is to make sure that we are complying with those rights. And then accountability. And that is about us being able to demonstrate compliance. And we're beginning to see a lot of that, you know, challenge. How are you going to comply with these requirements? Especially I think from the big government authorities. Say, for example, if you ask for NHS data, and they're going to talk about that next, they will want to see that you're going to do what you say you're going to do, not just have a tick box exercise. But we're also beginning to see that a bit on the education side, actually in relation to education data. So it's not just that we, you know, we comply and it's all fine, but we have to be able to demonstrate that, which can actually be a little bit more burdensome. And sometimes when we're asking for things, it's because we're thinking about that accountability part. Should we go to the next slide quickly? So this is what we're assessing when we're looking at the risks. It's these regulations. We have mapped these to our risks. So all of these will theoretically be covered by our policy. If you follow the policy, you should be able to comply with all of these regulation. And some of these things are flagged up there. So for example, we were just having a bit of a chat there about, you know, data and why it matters if we're talking about overseas collaborators. And it's because you will start hitting things like the Export Control Act, depending on what you're dealing with. You would also start hitting things like prohibition on export of personal data under GDPR, unless, of course, you have specific safeguards in place. So as Catherine says, it's not that, you know, these things are a problem, quote unquote, it's just that you may need to have additional safeguards. And that's usually what the issue is. I mean, even with export control, you can get a license, right? So it's not like it's just completely banned necessarily. There might be something that is, you know, nuclear research to certain countries might be completely banned. But usually it will be more, well, we just need to make sure we've got the correct safeguards in place, and quite often that's contractual. So it just means that you need to think ahead sometimes about these things. And in fact, there may already be contracts in place. Sometimes we've got framework agreements where we just say, oh yes, okay, it's fine. Actually, we're already set up for that. Let's go. So that's what we've been mapping in the background, but it's almost just to say, look, you don't actually need to think about that. We've thought about it already in the policy, but it may be where you've got a sort of it should be a signpost in policy to say, if you're doing this, you may need to do an additional assessment, or you may need to come and talk to us. And it's because there's something there that we think might be triggering a piece of legislation we're worried about, or a funder requirement we're worried about. Right, let's go to the next one. And at high level, right, what are these things about? What's the regulation trying to codify quite often, and particularly in the context of data privacy, which we're going to talk about next? They are basically trying to codify these sorts of rights and freedoms, right? So they are thinking about thought, conscience, religion, freedom of expression, assembly, association, bodily integrity, private life, family life, and freedom from discrimination. And the regulation is trying to codify that. We're trying to deal with it from an ethical point of view. The funders are trying to think about these things. Obviously, they are quite difficult, and it's sometimes at the edge not a straightforward tick box exercise. And some of these things conflict with each other. So sometimes, you're going to have to do some balancing, and it can be quite difficult. But we don't want to stop anybody being able to do some interesting research. We want to be able to make sure that we can enable that, and that's basically what all of our processes are set up to try and do. Right. Next, I think we're moving on to talk about GDPR, and David is going to take over from me. And this is just a bit of a basic run through.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm David Cull, Senior Information Governance Officer here at Durham University. I think this is just basically how we define what personal data is. So the definition that we have is anybody that can be identified or who are identifiable directly from information or who can be indirectly identified. So direct information is information that you're collecting about individuals, such as things like name, ID, reference number, or addresses that are relevant to individuals. And some of the indirect information which can also be collected as well is online identifiers like IP addresses, any kind of log-on information, GPS data, that kind of thing, which can also form part of a person's personal data. So information isn't truly anonymized if there is some kind of an ID reference or something that links to a person's data. So if you've got an ID number, which you think kind of anonymizes things, if somebody else has access to that ID number that links to the personal data, then it isn't truly anonymized in that way. I think that's the next slide, please. And then leading on from that is special category data. So there's a big list there of what special category data is: racial, ethnic origin, political opinions, religious or philosophical beliefs, trade union membership, genetic data or biometric data, which is used for identification purposes, which can be even things like fingerprints, which are used for access to systems, that kind of thing. That would be personal data. Any health data, data concerning person's sex life, sexual orientation, and also criminal allegations, proceedings or convictions isn't included in this. That's dealt with separately. So as I said, I think some of the things that we're talking about, the main one for biometric data that's commonly used is fingerprints. Whether someone's been arrested for a crime, that's direct examples of information. And I think Niall actually talked about some of the indirect information before when he's talking about CCTV, where you can identify people from the way that they walk. So that's kind of indirect information. And the key question, as it says there, is whether the inferences are correct, but whether you're actually using them to link to one of the special categories. So I think it's more whether that is intended information that you're collecting, or kind of it's a side effect of what you're actually collecting. I think one of the things to mention as well around the special category data is that there's two conditions that you actually need to meet before you're able to collect that. So there's one which is called Article 6, which is kind of your normal reasons for processing, which would be consent, contract, or research, that kind of thing. And then you need another category as well, which is called an Article 9, things like health and social care, public health, that kind of thing. So it's kind of an extra protection on that data because it is so sensitive. And some information about what are controllers and processors. So controllers are the main decision makers, the people who are more often than not the ones that are deciding what happens with the data at the first point. You can have joint controllers. So one controller can be sharing information with another controller, but they don't tell them what they can and they can't do with that data. They may well use it for their own individual purposes, and they decide how that's processed. A processor is normally somebody that receives the information from a controller, but they are actually told what they can and they can't do with that. So there'll be restrictions in place, and those things are normally dealt with under contracts. So the contracts will specify what can and can't be done with the data, what data is actually going to be transferred as well. And there's also other things that would be put in place, all these kinds of things which you really need to think about before you actually process personal data. So a data protection impact assessment, that'll tell you what kind of information you're processing, whether it's a high risk or a low risk. And then you can kind of go through there and say what processes you're putting in place, how you're going to secure that data. how it's going to be processed, if there's anything, is it going to be shared outside of the EEA, which is, I think, things that we've talked about. Sharing personal data with the US is a bit more of an issue recently, because Privacy Shield was previously in place, but that's no longer allowed. So there was other kind of restrictions and also controls that you'll need to put in place before you can share data with the US. So those are the things that you would need to think about. And these would all come up as part of the DPIA. There's also security assessments. So CIS have a questionnaire that we use, which will identify how the data is stored, where it's going to be stored, what kind of security is in place, the backups, that kind of thing. So these are all issues that you need to think about. And you should always have in place for personal data a data sharing agreement as well. That could be formed as part of a contract, or it can be something that's separate. But it just explains exactly what's happening to the data, how it's going to be used. The supplier due diligence. So processors are asked to provide information as well. That's normally part of the security questionnaires. And the data export equivalence assessment. So that's where data is shared outside of the EEA. So what restrictions are needed to be put in place there? It's normally standard contractual clauses are things for the US specifically as well that are needed to put in place for that. And I think that's that one. And then I think it's back to Kristina now, who's going to talk you through some of the data privacy issues.
Yeah, thanks, David. As you can sort of see from the previous slide, we have quite a lot of assessments at the moment in Durham. We're trying to consolidate some of them, particularly the CIS tech assessment with the data privacy impact assessment. But it's a work in progress. The rest of it is really around contractual agreements, and a lot of the time they may already be in place if you've got a framework agreement, but they may not. So, and that's the thing that you probably need to get sorted out first before you start actually sharing data. Right, okay, this is just something that was in the news quite a while ago, and there's quite a few different stories of this sort of thing happening. This is, you've probably seen it, right? This is the New York taxi data that was released anonymized. It was released because of a freedom of information request in the States. They had to release it. And a lot of people did some work with it. So one guy, Anthony Tucker, did an analysis looking at hand-stamped paparazzi photos of celebrities. And he could track, a particular individual got tracked to a strip club. Nice. But he was also able to identify, you know, things like property value, relationship status, even profile pictures of people. So he could get a huge amount of information about individuals by combining just a couple of data sets together, which of course was not at all intended when the data set was released, because they thought it was thoroughly anonymized. This tells you two things. One, it's re-identified some data. But number two, it also allowed him to create special category data, because the guy who was going to the strip club, that tells you something about him. It tells you something about his sexual behavior, which is special category data. So it's possible not just to identify data, but also sometimes to create special category data when you're not intending to. And I've come across this quite a few times. I had another example of something I was working on when I used to work in the financial sector. We had an app which was all around flashing up on your phone a little notification if someone had spent some money somewhere where they shouldn't have. So it was like a fraud protection thing. But it would flash up something if someone spent something on your card. And it did it by using Google Maps and payment codes, and then combining it to your bank account. Now, a lot of that data is totally separately. That data is totally sort of neutral data, really. And you've got Google Maps itself is just, you know, location information. It's not personal data at all. But we found it was doing things like flashing up, you know, hello, your husband has just gone to a sex club, things like that. So you could create special category data, not only create it, flash it up on someone's phone if they've got their notifications switched on, in a way that would really publicize what was happening to them. Obviously, that's a massive privacy issue and was not at all intended. But it was because of the nature of the data. And sometimes you need to sort of think these things through a little bit. On the one hand, it was actually the Google Maps data that's causing the problem, because it gave you the address, and the address then told you where the spend was. And they had to go through and cleanse that data as much as possible to take out what they thought might create special category data if it was combined with the transaction data. So that was kind of an interesting example of this sort of thing that can go wrong. So this is just an example, things to think about when you're doing this. It's got to do with, you know, inferring data from other data sets, combining data sets together. And a lot of it's got to do with the degree of risk. So what I would say is sometimes, David's spoken about, you can have an identifier on a list of data sets. If you are not making that public, you probably could say, well, that's anonymous, or at least it's pseudonymized to a point where we're all content. If you make something public, the big problem is you just don't know what data other people have, and it is very easy to re-identify data unless it's aggregated. So, and we would tend to say, we also do freedom of information. So we would tend to say, if you are not aggregating your setup to at least 5-6 people in a cohort, it's probably not anonymized, really. You'd be able to identify if you're publishing it. So a lot depends on what exactly you're doing with the data. If you're holding it yourself and you are the only person with a key, or in fact, you're just holding something and somebody else has the key altogether, that's even better, right? That's probably anonymous or pseudonymized to the extent that you want it to be. And a lot of it has to do with the extent to which you pseudonymized or anonymized data. It's very difficult to say something is completely anonymized unless you do the aggregation step. And quite often, if you do that, it's not that useful. Depends what you're doing. So there's really not a clear-cut argument about this. The previous study that I was actually looking for was the Victoria Health, which is an Australian study. I couldn't find it, which is really annoying. But Google if you can find it. That's where they released a load of information to freedom of information medical records. And they thought that they'd anonymized it sufficiently. I think they've done so many steps to anonymize it. But because it was published, the fact is people could combine 3 or 4 data sets and find it. So, and they got Kylie Minogue's medical records, which was not great for her. Maybe that's why I can't find it on the internet anymore. They may have taken enough information about it down. But it's this sort of danger, and well, actually, how anonymized does it need to be? It kind of depends what you're doing with it to a certain extent, which is why this question is not clear cut, and there's a lot of guidance on it. But we're happy to help with that if you ever have any questions. And then I'm done because I think I'm probably running over time, but please ask some questions if you have any.
And I don't know if it's worth saying on this that if you're having data, you're pushing data out to a third-party service, that counts as sharing data. So that service is the data processor. So you may need to have your data sharing agreements or other arrangements in place if you are looking at using, for example, a system at another university. And also if you're looking at putting things out into the cloud, it's important to look at where that data is stored. Where is it going on its journey? It may be going outside the EEA as part of its journey, and that's something you need to be careful about if you're using personal data.
Yes, that's actually one of the things that people are very worried about. So it depends what the data is, right? So number one, what's the data? Number two, if the data is personal data, you will then need to look at that country and region. You have to do what they call an equivalence assessment. Your first bit of the equivalence assessment is, what are the regulations like? If the regulations are non-existent, then it's not equivalent in terms of the regulation. Then you say, well, what safeguards can I put in place to make sure that I'm okay to share with that place? And it may be you can deal with that by contract. You have to take a view of what the regime looks like there. It may be that you can deal with it by technical measures, and that means only sharing anonymized data, properly anonymized data. And that's what you'll need to look at. It will have to be looking at the safeguards. And the other thing that you can look at, and this is a little bit contentious, but I have seen this done, is to say, well, what do I actually think will really happen to that data? So you sometimes have this weighing up around, the US is a good example, right? But it could be any country where there are issues with privacy. We know that there's a court case that says the US, the rules and regulations are not good enough in terms of European data. So it's not equivalent from a regulatory standard. And you can argue about that if you like, but that's the position at law because that's been decided. So then you say, well, what can I do in terms of safeguarding that data in contract? You can, and one of the things you can do is have the contractual clauses in place, but you probably also need technical measures. Now, if you can encrypt your data, so they're just getting anonymous data, then you're probably fine. So then tick, fine. The third step to that is to say, okay, I'm just going to take a view on this. I actually don't think the security services in the US want to read this data. They're not interested in it. So I will assume that they're not going to look at it. It's not particularly harmful. And on that risk basis, I'll say broadly, for my purposes, I'm equivalent because I've got a nice contract in place. I don't think anyone will interfere with that contract. It will be secure and no one will interfere with it. That's sort of fact-based. That's a little contentious, but you can take that position. So there are two types of data sharing. One is data sharing within the EEA broadly, and then there's data sharing overseas. But even data sharing within the EEA requires certain provisions to be in place. You will have responsibility for that data as a data controller, so you will be responsible for ensuring it is secure when it's on your side of the agreement. But that's why you have agreements in place in the first place, because it will set out what your responsibilities are versus what your counterparty's responsibilities are. But if you're processing it, so you're holding it, let's say you, right? I mean, your institution or organisation will be responsible for making sure that data is handled appropriately on their side. That's a difficult question. How long is a piece of string? I think I would say it depends how. It might depend on the sort of place you're thinking about. And so from my point of view, I'd be thinking about more difficult places will be A, outside Europe, right? It's always more difficult. And B, places that are a bit more unusual for us to think about. And that's probably a bit unfair, but even though the US is difficult, so David has mentioned quite a lot of court cases on the US, in a way we kind of understand what the position is, so we would probably be able to deal with it quite quickly. But if you were sharing with somewhere, I don't know, Turkey, something I'll be less familiar with. So it's a little bit difficult how long's a piece of string there, but we'd have to start from scratch. We're looking at what's actually in place there, what's the regime. That might take a bit longer, and also what's the data. More sensitive the data, more likely, more we need to think about it.
It would depend on individual institutional processes as well, I think. Probably going to your institution's information governance team to see how they're set up for that kind of assessment.
I would like to spend a few minutes talking about responsible research innovation. So essentially, I've put the definition up there from EPSRC, but the shorter version of it is that responsible research innovation basically means that researchers should work with other stakeholders to align the research process and the outcomes with the best benefit and the best outcome for society. I mean, it sounds obvious, right? It sounds obvious. And there are lots of benefits to that in terms of improving the quality of the research, improving the potential impact of the research, getting better buy-in, all the things that Catherine talked about ethics, trust, public support, funding, improved outcomes, all those things are important. It is difficult though, because I mean, we'll come on to the area framework in the next slide. There are real challenges in doing this really well. I mean, I'll give you a few examples of those challenges now. The first one, which is the Collingridge dilemma, it's all about information control. So if I have an idea, I have a brilliant idea, whilst it's in my head, I have perfect control over it. If I mention it to Catherine, then she also then has part ownership and control of that idea. If we have a staff meeting and then Kristina and David are in there, well, again, I've spread the load a bit. I might improve that idea, that's true, but I also have less control. As soon as I go to a conference and talk about it in a conference proceeding or publish it, my control, subject to a few legal safeguards, evaporates. What that might be used for is entirely out of my hands. So think of it in terms of a facial algorithm, if you like, that works really well. You say it's for this, I'm going to use it to improve airport security. We publish that, a different government gets hold of it and they use it to identify people who are politically opposed to the regime. What control do you have over that? And it's a real challenge when you're looking at this. The second challenge I'd like to highlight is we don't live in a perfect world. We have to take the world as we see it. To give a non-computer example, if I was going to redesign Durham City from scratch, it would not look the way it looks now. It was not built for the age of the car, and it could probably do with a mass transit system, if I'm totally honest. But we are where we are. It's been here for a very long time, and that is true for all of society. So what you put into the world is born of and will impact that world. You're not starting from scratch. The other thing, I suppose, is around imperfect information. We all act in ways which seem appropriate to ourselves, but I don't know everything. Society doesn't know everything. If you engage stakeholders in this, they have agendas. If you engage with a particular patient group on something, they will have an agenda and they will push that forward. I suppose the other thing that I would add there is it's really hard to to reach bits of society. I mean, this is true for research generally anyway, but it's really hard to reach some stakeholders. They're not represented. And when they're not represented, they have no voice. And so that means that doing RRI requires you to really spend, you can get a lot of the way there with a little bit of time, but to do it really well, that extra time to get very small extra bit of information, but it's key. The other thing as well is about, I suppose, coming back to the algorithm example, is about unintended consequences. With the best will in the world, you can put something out there that will have massive unintended consequences. And my favorite example on this is Thomas Midgley. So Thomas Midgley is responsible for some absolutely catastrophic environmental disasters. So he was an American in the 20th century, early 20th century, invented lots of things. One of his innovations was lead in petrol. So that's to help with knocking, damages engines, it reduces the driving experience. So you add lead, tetralead to petrol, it reduces knocking. I'm not going to give him the benefit of the doubt here, because it was really clear early on that that was a spectacularly bad idea. Everyone was saying it was a spectacularly bad idea. And yet it went on, because as soon as that process was in place of adding lead to petrol, there was a business there. Even when it was clearer that, if there's any chemists who tell me that I'm wrong, even when it was clearer that adding ethanol to it was as good, they carried on because that's the way it was working. Lead poisoning is with you in your soft tissues and your bones for years and years. Since they phased out in America, there's been a reduction in lead in people's bodies for about 75%. It had a massive impact, 5,000 or so heart attacks a year, that sort of thing, as well as all the behavioral things which are less clear. So I'm not going to give him the benefit of the doubt on that one. But the other thing that he did is he invented a CFC. So brilliant refrigerants, nothing to criticize him about there. They do a wonderful job. He didn't know, we didn't know until later in the century, that they were also destroying the ozone layer. Unintended consequences. See a need, meet that need, but what happens afterwards? And I think the key thing there as well is the time and effort. The questions you should ask yourself around responsible research innovation is, who is going to be impacted by what you're doing? What are the potential uses I can see for that? And again, the more stakeholders you bring in, the more likely you are to get a gathered field of views and insights. And the final one is, who can I engage with, and what existing patient groups, what existing forums are there that I can lean into to get that sort of broad-based engagement. So I've included on the next page the area framework. I mean, this is the UK one. There is an EU one, which is arguably better and clearer. But in essence, this gives you and I don't intend to go through it now, but this gives you a way, and it's a cycle, a way to think about it. What do you think the impacts are going to be? Reflect on those, see if they stand up to a bit of internal scrutiny, engage with other people to broaden that out, act on that, reassess what your research is going, where it's going, again, and then once you've got to that point, start the cycle again. So if I do this differently, and I mean, it might be, so to give you an example, it might be looking at new battery technology. And one of the things that, going back to the sustainability point that someone raised earlier, batteries rely on rare earths. Rare earths are mined in largely poor countries by people in absolutely diabolical conditions. If you were going to look at a new battery technology, could you look at something that then used something that wasn't mined in those areas or was less rare? What impact would that have on the cost and the uptake? But what positive impacts would then that have on broader society and so on? Things like that. Consider about things like recycling as well. That's one example, and that's easy. That's an easy example because I can see that in my mind. When you're looking at things like computer science and algorithms and outcomes, I see that being very difficult. It is worth engaging with, though. It's worth trying. I will jump into the Cambridge Analytica case study. So I'm sure everyone on the call is familiar with this. Cambridge Analytica was a political consulting firm. It was active from 2013. It had, and I won't get into the point of whether or not it made these impacts, but it claimed impacts that they could swing election campaigns by understanding voter behavior, motivating particular groups, demotivating and suppressing the vote of other groups by targeted advertising. I mean, the key question here, and the one that will come on to the next slide, is they think, how did they manage to turn a bit of research by Alexander Kogan from Cambridge on Facebook likes and 87 million scraped Facebook records into a vote swinging intervention? How did they do it, and what are the ethical ramifications of that? As we all know, the company was shut down in that particular guise. I believe that various bits of it are continuing in other ways, partly because there's obviously a market for it, for lobby groups and political parties. But let's go on to what I'll quickly do is, for people who aren't familiar with how it works, and again, I'm not a computer scientist, so feel free to correct me if I get anything absolutely critical wrong here. But yes, feel free to jump in, but I'll quickly cover what it is, how it worked, some of the issues that came up from that. How does it work? I mean, no matter how fancy the computer science that you've got here, you need a training set. You need something for it to work on. And that has to be large enough to be valid as well. So it really should be looking at hundreds of thousands. You'll see on the next page that it's about 30,000, but engaging lots of people is challenging. So there's two things. The training set is the data set in its entirety. So the personality profile. So we'll see on the next page that what happened was individuals were targeted with a personality test, 120 questions. They were paid a certain amount of money to do that, between $1 and $4 if you were a bored Hamptons housewife. I'm sorry for the broad overview, but if all that you were doing were entertaining yourself, you got about $1. If you're in the harder to reach category, so if you're a black male, then you got about $4, so you've got 4 times as much. That's very pleasing from a equality perspective, but it shows you something about that. You need to have the training data set. You need the feature set. So once you've got something that links to together, the feature set is a subset of the data that you then make predictions on. Then you need the targets that you're going to predict. And so they use something called the Ocean model. And basically, the personality test, the Ocean model, it's about traits across time. So there's 5 traits they looked at. It's openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And the reason they picked that is that these things tend to hold quite steady over time. So if you are a gregarious and outgoing person today, you're likely to be an outgoing and gregarious person tomorrow, next month, and next year. So they hold quite still. You then get to the ensemble model, where you combine all of the different data together, and you take different approaches, add more data, and reverse engineer it to fill in the blanks. And then you say, I've got a model. So this is a bit clearer on the next page, Catherine, if we go on to it. So this is what we had for the target set. 30,000 people completed personality test. As a condition of that, to claim their reward, they had to log in through Facebook. Boom, they get their $1 to $4. What then happened was, as part of that, the app also scraped all of the personal data that it had about that individual, their name, their location, and also all of their data from their friends. So there was those people, from a very clear consent perspective, even if the first people could have gone into it with their eyes open, the second lot couldn't. We then get that bigger data set. So pulling in that, we get to the ensemble model, and someone can probably explain this better than me, but basically I understand it as a Darwinian environment where different algorithms compete. The ones which seem to give the most valid ones are then the ones that come out of that. So there's 253 algorithms that said, we can give you a prediction on people's voting behavior based on these profiled records we've got from them. And then the US scandal was they used that to micro-target ads to individuals in key states to swing the election. And again, so some of it was positive reinforcement, go do this, this is what we say. A lot of it was negative advertising about, suppressing votes. So that, in a nutshell, is how that works. Knowing that, and I'll double check and make sure that's clear to everyone. I mean, I picked a familiar example, but hopefully that is clear. These are the core questions I think it'd be useful to unpack. What issues did the Cambridge Analytica scandal raise? Should the work have gone ahead? Are there any additional controls that could have been put in place? And I will let you think about that from a research and from a legal perspective. And if you want to do the work again, what changes could be put in place to rules and laws to make it be done ethically? I think is a fifth question. I mean, being as where we are in the session now, it would be really useful if you could take the time to reflect on if there are any ethical issues in what you're doing.
I'm just going to take it sort of all together because we just had a general conversation about it, but we had quite an interesting conversation. I think there were like sort of two different feelings in the room about the whole Cambridge Analytica issue. I think there was one group of people who just really felt actually the whole thing wasn't very ethical, and they just don't think that's a good use of data. It shouldn't really happen. And, you know, actually there's a big activist movement around that feeling too, particularly in the context of political campaigns, lack of transparency, manipulation, and really the whole thing is just couldn't be justified use of the data. There were some other people who felt that, you know, you could actually have done something to make it work. Let's get some transparency. Let's make sure the data is anonymized as soon as possible. And then we could maybe use that data in a way that would be useful in that context. But we all acknowledge that there was a real challenge around transparency and explaining to people what's happening, both in terms of the collection of the data, what happens behind the scenes, and then what the data is then used for. Because we know that dark ads and things like that went out, and so there's a big transparency challenge, and I guess a lot of it turns on, can we ever really deal with that challenge sufficiently effectively to make that ever really work? Some people feel and some people feel, no, actually I don't think it's really ever gonna be ethical.
So similarly, I think we had questions around the potential for controls of this kind of thing, and also transparency was a key thing that came up for us about whether people were aware of, even the first set of people who opted in were aware of that kind of what their data was going to be used for. We had a bit of a conversation around when is actually that kind of initial opt-in okay or not. And we also had a conversation around need potentially for reconsenting about use of data. So if you don't know at the beginning how the data is going to be used or what issues are going to come up around identification of data that you're using, then having a process, particularly with health data, which is the example we had in the group, of having a process where you are in touch with the patients who've provided that data and you're talking to them about, this is how the data is going to be used, this is the benefits, this is why we're doing it, and getting their agreement to how it's going to be used. That is kind of the gold standard for when you're using that kind of sensitive data. But we also raised some of the challenges around that. When you have massive data sets potentially involving millions of people, how would you do that? And also if you have changes in your research team, about making sure that everybody in the research team actually knows and is aware of those processes that are in place.
I mean, I'll come back on that. I think we had a discussion about the benefit of it as well. And actually, I suppose the main benefit of doing that research, the academic benefit of doing it, and the societal benefit of doing it was being the canary in the coal mine, of letting people know that, do you know what you are? There are ways in which people can profile your behavior and manipulate you. And once you're wise to that, that takes away some of the power of that when and if it does happen in a different way. I guess the other things that we covered that were slightly different. I mean, there were concerns raised about data reuse and outputs reuse and the amount of control you have over there. I think that was valid. Those are really valid points. But broadly, I think people did feel that they were quite on top of the issues at the start of the research, so where you're getting your data from, making sure it's ethically obtained and so on. But the challenges really were at the end. Okay, we've got about 5 minutes left. I'd like to open the floor up to anyone who's got any questions. So, I mean, we had a question we had a point coming up from our group around that in terms of extending the role of the right to privacy and so on to the online world. There is an education perspective. It's complicated. It's difficult. Clicking the button say yes is a very easy thing to do. I think it's just something that needs to be plugged from an individual perspective. These are personal views. From an individual perspective, I think we can be more careful. From a societal perspective, it's the power of the government to regulate it. That's ultimately where this has to come from, because the power and the control is very firmly with the big tech companies and big data collectors like that. So from my perspective, it has to be regulated and has to come from there. But I'll ask anyone else on the panel, if you're a panel now, if they've got any comments.
Yeah, I mean, we had this extremely difficult conversation about transparency. So this is where it's come from. I think it's very difficult because the regulator can only do so much in a place where a lot of this is international. And so there is an element where just getting people to understand what's happening is probably quite important, because when you have local regulators, there's a limit to what they can do with big platforms like Google or Facebook, realistically. So I think there's two things there. One is, yeah, can you get the regulation to work, and can we get it more harmonized? And yes, that's sort of happening, but it will be slow. But the other is just like, can you understand what's actually happening to your data in the background? Because I also don't think we're likely to stop doing that for lots of different reasons. It's very effective commercially, from a surveillance, intelligence, security point of view. The big Western governments are not going to stop doing it. So I think it's almost like, can you understand? I think it's important for people to understand it's happening, and I think people probably don't understand what's happening in the background. So it's difficult for them to challenge, because they do have quite lots of rights to challenge and things like that. And the regulation really relies on people challenging. It doesn't really give a lot of power to regulators unless there's challenge from individuals. And people can't challenge if they don't understand what's happening.
I suppose the one thing I'd add there is that is where the research governance framework universities have can be really helpful. So in some respects, it comes across as being bureaucratic. So to give an animal research example, there are programs to eradicate grey squirrels in the northeast to stop them encroaching on red squirrels' environment. You can do that without much license at all. As soon as that becomes animal research, capturing the same animal in the same way, we'll make you fill an enormous form, and we'll make you apply to the Home Office for a license for it. But actually, I suppose that's the example of the bureaucratic side of it. But we do require things around consent and advising people on the information you give to participants, and that actually is really helpful in terms of informing them about what you're going to use their data for. So we are, in one sense, writing an extra layer, but it's a helpful and useful layer in terms of spreading the benefits of the research and so on.
I think there are lots of things in place that people have to follow, such as you explain to people what you're going to use the personal data for and that kind of thing. But often it's quite difficult to do that in a nice, easy, concise way. And I think you find when you sign up to a lot of agreements and things, you'll have like 30, 40 pages just to say what we're going to do with your personal data. And it kind of has the opposite effect, where people tend to not read it because it's just so onerous to go through it all. So I think that's one of the difficulties as well, is to try and kind of get across what you're going to do with the personal data in a nice, kind of concise way, which makes it easy for people to understand and follow.
I just want to say thanks to everyone, particularly my co-presenters, but also to all of you for engaging with this. If you have any questions, obviously if you're at Durham, then you can contact us. But there are people in your institutions who can really help you get to the bottom of this if you've got questions. But thank you very much.